My husband demanded a divorce. He took the house, the cars, every dollar. I only asked to keep our son. His lawyer smirked when I signed the papers, certain she'd already won. I didn't argue. I didn't blink. I just kept signing page after page while the man I'd married stared straight ahead like I was furniture he was finally getting rid of. Then, right before the judge could close the file, a phone rang, and 3 words screamed by the one person in that room who thought she had nothing left to lose brought the entire courtroom to a dead stop. But to understand why those 3 words landed the way they did, you have to go back to the beginning. Courtroom 4 at the Montgomery County Courthouse smelled the way it always did, old paper floor wax, and something underneath that never quite washed out no matter how many times the janitor mopped. I'd walked through that building more times than I could count over 20 years as a title examiner, digging through deed books and probate files for other people's houses. I never once imagined I'd sit in this particular chair on this particular morning, waiting to lose everything I'd spent half my life building. Gary sat 2 rows over gray suit hair, combed neat face, arranged into something calm and businesslike, like this was just another Tuesday. He hadn't looked at me once since we walked in. He'd gotten good at that over the last 8 months, not looking, not asking, not needing to know what I thought about any of it. My attorney, Frank Delgado, sat beside me. He was somewhere north of 50 with a low, patient voice, and the tired eyes of a man who'd read too many case files under fluorescent light. Under the table, he gave my hand a small squeeze. "You can still change your mind," he murmured one last time. "We can ask for a continuance." I shook my head. Judge Whitmore came in, robe rustling. Everyone stood, then sat. The chairs scraped the floor louder than they should have, like the whole room was holding its breath. "We're here to finalize the dissolution of marriage between Gary Whitfield and Diane Whitfield," she said, voice flat professional, like she'd said that exact sentence 1,000 times before. Maybe she had. Gary's attorney, Renee Castillo, read through the terms with the kind of satisfaction that didn't even try to hide itself. The house on Larkspur Drive his, both cars his, every savings account, every retirement fund, every share of his landscaping business his in full. I kept exactly 1 thing: custody of Noah, our son, 19 years old, halfway through his 2nd year at the community college across town. I signed each page one at a time. The pen felt heavier than it should have, not because writing my own name was hard, but because that name had spent 22 years attached to things that mattered. Teaching a kid to ride a bike down a cracked driveway. Patching a leaking roof myself because we couldn't afford a contractor that spring. Paying every bill on time, even the months it hurt. Gary smiled while he watched me sign. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile a man wears when he thinks he's just won a game the other player quietly forfeited. He didn't know, nobody in that room knew yet, that the packet I'd filed along with the settlement, the one Renee Castillo hadn't bothered reading closely, held a truth that had been sitting quietly in a county filing cabinet for 27 years. I hadn't lied to anyone. I'd simply stopped covering for him. I want to be clear about something because people always assume the worst when a marriage ends this fast, this quiet. I didn't set out to destroy Gary. I set out to survive him. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always look like one from the outside. Title work is a strange profession to explain to people. Most folks think a house is the most solid thing they'll ever own. You can't misplace it, like a set of keys can't have it walk out the door on you. But underneath every clean-looking deed, there are layers. Old mortgages nobody paid off correctly, inheritance disputes nobody settled. A clause somebody's grandmother had written into a transfer 30 years ago that everybody since had simply forgotten existed. My whole career was built on finding the things people assumed weren't there. After 20 years of that work, you stop being able to turn the habit off. You start looking at your own life the same way. Searching for the clause, nobody mentioned the crack under the paint, the thing that looks solid until the day it isn't. I'd been doing that to my marriage for longer than I wanted to admit. Judge Whitmore reviewed the final page, adjusted her glasses, and looked up. "Mr. Whitfield, you're agreeing to these terms in full." "I am," Gary said without hesitation, like he was ordering lunch. "And Mrs. Whitfield—" "Yes," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, almost like it belonged to someone braver than me. The clerk slid the settlement packet across the table first to me. The stack was thick, the pages still warm from the copier down the hall. My hand hovered over the pen for 1 second longer than it needed to. Not because I was uncertain about what I was doing. Because I finally completely was. I thought about Noah at 8 years old, sitting on an upside-down bucket in the garage, handing me screws like they were treasure. I thought about the pencil marks on our kitchen door frame, tracking his height year after year. I thought about a phone lighting up blue in the dark at 2:17 in the morning, and 2 words glowing on the screen that changed everything I believed about my life. I signed. My name looked smaller than I expected on that page. I slid the papers back across the table. Gary picked them up eagerly, flipping through to make sure every line was there, every box checked, every asset accounted for. Whatever was coming next, he had no idea it was already sitting in the room with him. None of this started in that courtroom. It started 8 months earlier at 2:17 in the morning in the dark kitchen of the house on Larkspur Drive. I want to back up and tell you what I do for a living because it matters more than you'd think. I'm a title examiner. Most people glaze over when I explain it at parties, so I've learned to keep it short before you buy a house. Somebody has to make sure the person selling it actually has the legal right to sell it, that there's no forgotten lien, no unresolved inheritance claim, no clause buried in a decades-old document that could undo the whole transaction. That somebody is usually me. I spend my days in county archives and digital record systems, tracing ownership backward through decades of paperwork, looking for the thing everyone else assumed wasn't there. We have a term for it in the business, a cloud on title. It's a defect that sits hidden in the chain of ownership, sometimes for generations, doing nothing, bothering no one, until the day someone tries to sell or transfer the property, and the cloud finally surfaces. People think land is the most solid thing a person can own. I know better. I know that solid is often just a word for something nobody's checked closely yet. 20 years of that work does something to you. You stop being able to shut the habit off when you clock out. You start looking at your own life with the same eyes, searching for the clause. Nobody mentioned the crack under fresh paint, the thing that looks fine on the surface and isn't fine at all underneath. I didn't know it yet, but I'd been doing exactly that to my marriage for a long, long time. That night I woke up thirsty. At 51, sleep doesn't hold together the way it used to. You wake for water for a stiff hip for no reason at all, and you shuffle down the hallway in your socks, past the same framed photos you've walked past 10,000 times. Noah at 8, grinning, holding up a bluegill he'd caught at Cedar Creek Lake. Gary and me at a Dayton Dragons game, sunburned, laughing at something I couldn't even remember anymore. The kind of pictures that make you believe you know exactly who you married. There was a blue glow coming from Gary's home office. The door was cracked open. I wasn't trying to spy, I want to be honest about that. I stopped because of the way he was sitting, hunched forward, thumbs moving fast over the screen. His whole body curled around the phone like he was protecting something from spilling out. The air in the hallway smelled faintly like his cologne, something new he'd started wearing that spring, sharper than the drugstore stuff he'd used for 20 years. I stood there in the dark, not breathing, and I read the words glowing white against the black screen from where I stood in the doorway. I can't wait until you're finally out of there. Our new life is going to be incredible. Then another message right behind it. Once you're free of that burden, you're going to feel like a completely different person. Burden. My throat went bone dry. My heart did that stupid frantic thing where it tries to punch its way straight out of your chest. Gary smiled at the screen. Not the polite, distracted smile he gave me across the dinner table most nights. A real one. The kind I hadn't seen aimed in my direction in longer than I wanted to admit. I backed away without making a sound, turned, and walked back to our bedroom on legs that didn't feel like mine anymore. I lay down in the dark. 20 minutes later, Gary slid in beside me, phone face down on the nightstand, moving carefully like a man trying not to wake someone he'd already left behind in every way that mattered. The next morning I did something that probably sounds strange. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry, didn't demand answers, didn't throw his phone against the wall the way some part of me wanted to. In my line of work, when you find a defect buried in a chain of title, you don't panic and try to tear up the whole transaction on the spot. You trace it, you verify it, you follow the paper trail one document at a time. because a hasty conclusion can make you miss something far bigger sitting just behind it. So I watched. Not his phone, not yet. I watched the way he talked, the way he'd started dressing, the small new habits that didn't line up with the man I'd known for 2 decades. Gary's landscaping company, Whitfield Outdoor Design, had been a small, steady operation for 15 years, mowing, mulching, planting shrubs for families across Elkridge. But that spring, he started talking about scaling up, about reinvesting in equipment, phrases that sounded professional and meant almost nothing when you asked him to explain them plainly. He started wearing a tailored jacket he hadn't owned before. He bought a watch I'd never seen, not until I went digging through the credit card statement and found it tucked inside a line item labeled business equipment expense, nearly $4,000 buried between a mower part and a tank of fertilizer like it belonged there. I didn't say anything, not yet. I filed it away the way I file away everything, quietly, precisely, without letting my face show what I already suspected. Because here's the thing about being a title examiner for 20 years, you learn that the truth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't kick the door down. It waits in a drawer, in a footnote, in a transaction nobody thought to question for exactly the moment someone finally decides to look. I was starting to look. In title work, there's a phenomenon we call progressive encumbrance. The slow, quiet accumulation of legal burdens on a property until it isn't clean anymore. It doesn't happen in a single night. It happens one small transaction at a time, so gradually that the owner sometimes doesn't notice until the damage is already done and the paperwork is already signed. That's exactly what was happening inside our house, and I was the only one keeping track. It started small. Gary traded in the old work truck he'd hauled mulch and mowers around in for years, a battered, dependable thing with a dent in the tailgate from a job gone wrong back in 2019, for a brand new pickup, glossy black, the kind of truck that made a statement in a driveway. "It's for the business," he said, like that explained the extra $600 a month. Then the leather sofa disappeared. We'd bought it the year Noah started middle school, saved for 3 months to afford it, argued in the showroom about whether the color was too dark for the living room. One Saturday afternoon, Noah and I drove to AutoZone to grab a part for my old Ford, and when we got home there was a cheap recliner sitting in its place, the kind that sags in the middle like it gave up on itself years ago. Noah stood frozen in the doorway, backpack still hanging off one shoulder. "Where's the couch, Mom?" Gary walked in from the kitchen carrying a Starbucks cup, easy and unbothered, like we were asking about the weather. "Lent it to a client, for a staging thing. It's fine, this one works just as well." I looked at my son. He didn't say what he was thinking, but I could see it plain as day. In the set of his jaw, our house was being hollowed out piece by piece, and his father was acting like it was nothing at all. I started noticing cardboard boxes in the garage sealed shut, scrawled in Gary's handwriting, "Equipment New Project." I started noticing our joint account dip at strange, irregular intervals, not groceries, not gas, but the kind of withdrawal pattern that suggested somebody was buying big-ticket items fast and quiet before anyone could ask why. And then I found it. Not at 2:17 in the morning, not in a stolen glance at his phone. I found it in the one place a woman like me can't lie to herself. Paperwork. Noah's college fund statement came in the mail on a Thursday afternoon, thin and official-looking in its white envelope. I'd gotten home early from a job, an old bungalow on the west side of town, with a basement that smelled like wet cardboard, and 40 years of secrets, and I did what I always do with mail. I sorted it at the kitchen counter, bills in one pile, junk in another. I opened the envelope without thinking twice. The balance was lower, not a little lower, thousands lower. My first instinct was that it had to be a mistake, a clerical error, something a phone call would fix in 10 minutes. Then I saw the transaction line, clean and merciless in black ink, transfer out, authorized by Gary Whitfield. I stood in my own kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once heard the word burden glow through a phone screen, and I felt something inside me shift the way a floor joist finally gives after years of quiet, invisible rot. That money wasn't ours the way Gary seemed to believe it was. That was Noah's future. Every skipped vacation, every year we drove cars until they rattled just to keep that account funded, so our son wouldn't drown in student loans the way half his friends already had. Gary had taken it the way you'd borrow a lamp from a neighbor casually, without asking, without thinking twice about giving it back. I heard the garage door groan open. Boots on the tile floor, confident, unhurried, the sound of a man walking into a life he already believed belonged to him. I slid the statement back into its envelope and set it down on the counter, not because I was afraid of him, but because for the first time I understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't simply leaving a marriage. He was stripping a house down to its studs and quietly selling off the lumber board by board while I was still living inside it. And I wasn't going to stop him by yelling. I was going to stop him the way I stopped any dangerous defect from hurting the people standing inside it, by letting the paperwork carry the weight it always eventually carries. That evening, Gary came home in a mood I hadn't seen in months, humming under his breath, cheeks pink from the cold, carrying a bag from some boutique downtown I didn't recognize. He set it on the counter, glanced at the mail pile, and for one brief second his eyes caught the corner of the investment company's envelope sticking out from underneath a stack of coupons. "Everything okay?" he asked, too casual, too quick. "Fine," I said. He studied me for a beat longer than usual, like he was checking a foundation for cracks he couldn't quite see yet. Then he shrugged it off and disappeared into his office, and I heard the familiar click of the door. I stood there in the quiet kitchen a long time after that, listening to the refrigerator hum the clock over the sink, ticking off seconds I used to take for granted. I thought about every building I'd ever inspected, records for every owner who swore up and down that everything was fine right up until the moment the whole structure gave way beneath them. I didn't confront him that night either. I went upstairs, opened the Notes app on my phone, and started a new file. I titled it Larkspur. I didn't sleep well after that. Not completely sleepless, I still drifted off, but the way you do in a hospital waiting room chair, in and out, never fully letting go of the world around you. Every sound in the house seemed louder those weeks. The refrigerator kicking on, wind pushing against the siding, Gary's steady, untroubled breathing beside me in the dark, like none of this was costing him a single hour of rest. In the title business, we sometimes talk about a slow chain of failure. A property doesn't lose its value all at once. It weakens quietly, one overlooked detail at a time, until the day the load finally exceeds what the structure can bear. I'd lie there some nights, tracing a hairline crack that ran along our bedroom ceiling toward the smoke detector, a crack I'd noticed years ago and told myself was nothing. Just settling. Cosmetic, not worth the trouble of fixing. I'd been telling myself that same lie about my marriage for a long time. Gary started spending less time at home. He called them client consultations, but the way he dressed for those consultations, pressed shirts, shoes that actually got polished instead of just wiped down, didn't match anything I'd ever seen associated with mowing somebody's backyard or laying mulch beds. Noah noticed. Kids always notice, even the ones who don't say much about it. We still had our routines. Saturday mornings I made pancakes, the boxed mix kind, way more butter than necessary. Noah would sit at the counter, scrolling his phone, hoodie, half-zipped hair sticking up the way it had since middle school, refusing every attempt to comb it flat. One morning, he asked, trying too hard to sound casual, "Dad working again today?" I flipped a pancake and let it land slightly off-center in the pan. "That's what he said." Noah nodded, eyes still on his phone. "Okay." That was Noah's way. He didn't push. He absorbed things quietly and carried them the same way I did, and some nights that worried me more than if he'd shouted about it. The business started swallowing more of our house without ever asking permission. The garage filled up with equipment I didn't recognize, mowers still in factory plastic boxes, of landscape lighting, labeled with a supplier's logo I'd never seen invoiced before. My own tools got pushed further and further back into a corner, my stepladder leaning against the wall like something nobody remembered owning anymore. Gary started referring to things as assets instead of belongings. Not furniture, not memories assets the way you'd talk about line items on a spreadsheet, instead of a life two people built together. One night he stood in the living room, hands on his hips, surveying the bare patches where our good furniture used to sit before it started disappearing one piece at a time. "I need the dining set next," he said, like he was reading off an inventory list. I looked up from tightening a hinge on the cheap replacement cabinet that had shown up the week before. "The table we actually eat at." He sighed, that particular sigh reserved for people he considered slow to understand something obvious. Diane, a potential investor, wants to see the full operation. I'll bring it back. When I'm done with it. Noah stood in the doorway, backpack still slung over one shoulder, listening the way he always did. I caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of my head. Don't say anything. I let it go again, but I started keeping careful track. Dates, times, which items left the house and never came back, which withdrawals lined up with which purchases. Not because I was building a trap, because that's simply how my mind works. You don't argue with rot, you measure it, document it, and you wait until the measurements speak for themselves. The real gut punch came on a gray, cold Tuesday evening, the kind of Ohio winter day where the sun never fully shows up at all. Noah was at a study group across town. Gary wasn't home. I had the house to myself, and I sat at the kitchen table with Noah's college fund statement spread out beside a yellow legal pad. I'd called the investment company that afternoon from my truck parked outside a job site with the engine still ticking as it cooled. "Ma'am," the woman on the line said, polite and distant, in the way customer service voices always are, "the transfer was authorized by an account holder." "Which one?" I asked. A pause I could feel through the phone. "Mr. Whitfield." I thanked her and hung up before she could hear anything change in my voice. I heard the garage door groan open. Gary walked in humming something under his breath, cheeks flushed from the cold, carrying a shopping bag from a boutique downtown. He froze the second he saw the papers spread across the table. "What's that?" he asked. "Noah's college fund," I said. He set the bag down slowly. "Why are you looking at that?" "Because it's missing money." His arms crossed. "It's an investment. It's coming back. You took it," I said, keeping my voice level the way I'd practiced in my head all afternoon. "You took our son's college money." His face hardened. "Don't be dramatic. It's marital money. It's for Noah." He rolled his eyes, the gesture so casual it made my stomach turn. "Noah will be fine. Kids figure it out. Besides, this business is for all of us." That's the moment I understood something I hadn't let myself fully accept until then. It wasn't just that he'd taken the money, it was that he genuinely didn't see anything wrong with having done it. Gary turned away, already finished with the conversation as far as he was concerned. "I'm exhausted, we'll talk later." Later never came, not the kind of later where anything got resolved. The house kept emptying out around us. The good chairs. The coffee table I'd refinished myself one summer with sandpaper and stubbornness. Noah's old study desk replaced by stacked boxes labeled "Inventory Do Not Touch." One evening I found a monthly charge on our bank statement. I didn't recognize a storage unit fee, not cheap on an industrial strip on the edge of town. When I asked Gary about it, he barely glanced up from his phone. "Overflow," he said. "For the business." I didn't push. I didn't need details. I needed the address. 3 weeks later, Gary announced he wanted a divorce, the same way he might announce a new business venture standing in the middle of our gutted kitchen, hands in his pockets, like the words cost him nothing at all. "I'm not happy," he said. "I want more out of life, and I'm not going to apologize for wanting that." He'd already spoken to a lawyer. He'd already decided exactly what he wanted. The house, the cars, the accounts, the business, every asset with his name attached to it, and a few that didn't have his name attached at all. Not really, not once you looked closely enough. I asked him one question. "What about Noah?" "What?" He waved a hand, the same careless gesture he used for everything that inconvenienced him lately. "He's basically grown. He can stay with you." Like Noah was a piece of furniture that had stopped fitting the new look he was going for. That night, after Gary went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The cheap recliner creaked under me when I lowered myself into it. The walls felt farther apart than they used to, the way a room does after too much has been carried out of it. I thought about every title search I'd ever run, every homeowner who swore up and down their paperwork was clean, right before I found the thing buried 30 years deep that changed everything. People always sound so certain right before the ground shifts under them. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I opened the Notes app on my phone, the file already titled Larkspur, and I kept writing. Gary filed the paperwork a week after he said the word out loud. No tears, no shouting, just signatures and an expression on his face, like a man finally stepping into the life he believed had been stolen from him. I called Frank Delgado the next morning. We'd known each other for years, met originally at a VFW fish fry, bonded over bad coffee and worse bingo prizes. He was the kind of lawyer who still shook your hand like it meant something. We met at a diner off Route 48, cracked vinyl booths, a bell over the door that rang every time the cook called an order ready. Frank listened while I talked. I didn't rush, didn't raise my voice. I laid it out the way I'd lay out a title report, facts first, feelings after. When I finished, he leaned back and rubbed his chin. "Diane, he's asking for a lot. We can fight this. You've got leverage the college fund alone." "I'm not here to fight," I said. He studied me over his coffee. "Then why are you here?" "Because I needed to know how a structure comes down without taking the wrong people with it." I didn't say it in those exact words, but I told him about Noah, about the withdrawals, about the way Gary was moving things out of the house like he was already gone. Frank sighed. "If you push back hard right now, he'll dig in. Motions, delays, fees. He'll bleed you dry before you ever see a courtroom." That matched everything my gut had been telling me for weeks. "And if I don't push back?" I asked. Frank hesitated. "You could lose almost everything." I looked down at my hands, thick-knuckled, a little scarred from 2 decades of pulling old files and paper-cut edges hands that had taught Noah to ride a bike, steadied him the day he learned to drive stick. "Almost everything isn't everything," I said. Frank watched me for a long moment. "You're planning something." "I'm planning to stop holding up a structure that's already failing," I said. "I just need to know how not to get crushed underneath it when it goes." That earned a slow nod. "Okay," he said. "Then we go quiet. No accusations, no theatrics. We document and we wait. Waiting's harder than fighting." It usually is. Gary took my silence for surrender. I could hear it in the way he talked to me those weeks, short, dismissive, already 3 steps into a life that didn't include me. He spent more time downtown, posting photos of finished landscaping projects with captions that read like victory laps. People commented with fire emojis, words like unstoppable boss. He liked every single one. Meanwhile, I did what I do best. I documented. I photographed the garage on the afternoons he wasn't home, the stacked equipment, the lighting fixtures still wearing supplier tags. I logged serial numbers the same way I'd log fixture details in a failed inspection. I pulled bank statements and highlighted the pattern in yellow transfers that matched purchases withdrawals from accounts that were supposed to stay untouched. And then, doing the exact kind of cross-reference I run for strangers' properties every week of my career, I found something that had nothing to do with Gary's spending habits at all. I was pulling county archive records for an unrelated client one afternoon, and out of pure professional habit, I decided to run a chain of title check on our own house. I'd never had a reason to before. 27 years married to the same man in the same house, why would I have? The deed to the Larkspur property had been transferred to Gary and me jointly back in 1998 by my grandmother Eleanor, a woman who trusted almost nothing without a lawyer's signature on it twice. Buried in the county archive attached to that original transfer was a codicil I had never once seen in my adult life, a clause specifying that in the event of divorce, sole ownership would automatically revert to her direct bloodline. To me. And through me, to Noah. I sat in my truck outside the courthouse a long time after I found it, engine off, hands not quite steady on the printed copy in my lap. Gary had no idea it existed. Neither did his lawyer. But I did. I'd spent my whole career learning to see exactly this kind of thing. Part 6, 3 words. The morning of the final hearing, I stood alone in the empty living room one last time. The walls gave back the sound of my own breathing. The cheap recliner sagged under its own weight in the corner, the only piece of furniture that had never once been asked to leave. I didn't feel angry. I felt something closer to resolve, the kind of steadiness that comes right before you set down a weight you've been carrying so long, your arms forgot what it felt like to be empty. I locked the front door behind me and left the key on the kitchen counter exactly where Gary would find it. At the courthouse, Gary smiled when he saw me. Not kindly. Confidently, the smile of a man who believes the math has already worked out in his favor. I took my seat beside Frank, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Renee Castillo leaned close to Gary, whispering something that made him nod and smile wider. I didn't need to hear the words to know the shape of them. We're about to win. Judge Whitmore reviewed the settlement terms aloud, her voice even, and practiced. The house on Larkspur Drive to Gary, the vehicles to Gary, the financial accounts as outlined, the full business interest retained solely by Gary. As she spoke, I felt each item slide away from me like a tool being set down for the last time. I didn't flinch. I'd already let go of these things in my head weeks ago. And custody of the party's son, Noah Whitfield. The judge continued, shall remain with Mrs. Whitfield as agreed by both parties. Gary nodded through that part like it barely registered. Judge Whitmore looked up. Mr. Whitfield, do you confirm your agreement to these terms in full? I do, Gary said without a beat of hesitation. And Mrs. Whitfield? Yes, I said, and my voice came out clear and steady. The clerk slid the settlement packet across the table to me first. The pages were thick, still warm from the copier. I picked up the pen. My hand hovered for one brief second, not from doubt, but because I knew exactly what I was doing. And some part of me wanted to feel the full weight of that moment before it passed. I thought about Noah on an upturned bucket in the garage, handing me screws like they were treasure. I thought about pencil marks climbing a kitchen door frame 1 year at a time. I thought about a phone glowing blue in the dark and the word burden sitting there like it had every right to. I signed. I slid the papers back. Gary reached for them, eagerly flipping through to be sure every asset was accounted for. When he finished, he handed the stack to Renee with a satisfied exhale, like a man setting down a heavy bag he'd been hauling too long. It should have ended there. Judge Whitmore squared the pages. Before I enter this into the record, is there anything further from either side? Renee started to shake her head. Frank stood. Your Honor, we respectfully ask the court to acknowledge the exhibits attached to the settlement. Gary turned sharply toward Renee. What exhibits? Renee frowned. What exhibits? The clerk handed Judge Whitmore a thin folder clipped behind the main settlement. Renee grabbed her own copy off the table and flipped it open eyes, moving fast down the page. Her expression shifted not dramatically at first, just a pause, a blink, the look of someone realizing a number doesn't add up the way it should. She flipped another page, then another. The color drained slowly out of her face. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses. Ms. Castillo. Renee stood so fast her chair screeched against the floor. Your Honor, I need a moment. Gary grabbed her arm. What is it? She shook him off, eyes still locked on the pages, breath gone shallow and quick. I sat perfectly still, hands folded, heart beating in a slow, even rhythm I hadn't felt in months. Renee's voice climbed despite herself. This changes everything. Judge Whitmore's brow furrowed. In what way? Renee looked at Gary, then back at the bench, panic breaking through the polished composure she'd worn all morning. Your Honor, the attached documentation shows the Larkspur property was transferred in 1998, with a codicil stating that in the event of divorce, ownership reverts automatically to the direct bloodline of the original grantor. Gary shot to his feet. What does that mean? Renee turned to him, eyes wide. It means the house isn't yours. The room stirred low murmurs, a cough somewhere in the back, someone in the gallery leaning forward to hear better. Gary spun toward me, face flushing red. Diane, what did you do? I met his eyes, calm. I signed exactly what you asked for. You tricked me. I shook my head. No, I just stopped covering for you. The bailiff shifted his weight alert now. The air in the room had gone heavier, denser, the way it does right before a storm finally breaks. Judge Whitmore held up a hand. Ms. Castillo, lower your voice. Renee swallowed hard, fighting to steady herself, but her voice still shook. Your Honor, with respect, my client has just accepted full sole ownership of a property that, according to this documentation, was never legally his to accept. Gary's phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket. He didn't move to answer it. His eyes were fixed on Renee, waiting for her to make sense of what she was holding. He didn't know about the codicil, Frank said, calm and even. Neither did counsel. It's been sitting in the county archive for 27 years, available to anyone who ran a full chain of title search before signing. My client happens to be the one person in this room qualified to know exactly where to look. Renee turned back to Gary, and this time her voice broke entirely, rising into something closer to a scream than a legal argument. You demanded everything, Gary, everything. And now you've just signed away every legal protection you had while accepting the liability for a property you don't even own. Gary's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And that's when the 3 words came, not from me, not from Frank, but torn straight out of Renee Castillo, in a moment of pure, uncontained panic, echoing off the old wooden walls of that courtroom, until the whole room went dead silent. It's not yours. Nobody moved. The bailiff froze mid-step. Judge Whitmore's pen stopped above the page like it had forgotten how to write. Gary stood there, mouth still open, staring at me like he was searching for something, regret, maybe, or mercy. So what about you? You just walk away clean, Judge Whitmore answered before I had the chance to. Mrs. Whitfield relinquished her claim to this property under the exact terms you requested, Mr. Whitfield. Liability follows ownership. The silence that followed was deeper than the one before it. Something in my chest loosened, not triumph exactly. Relief. The weight I'd been quietly holding up for years had finally slid off my shoulders. Judge Whitmore struck the gavel once. This court is adjourned pending further review. I didn't look back as I walked out. The cold Ohio air hit my face sharp and clean, and I took the deepest breath I'd taken in 8 months. For the first time in a long time, the structure behind me wasn't mine to hold up anymore. Part 7. The New House. The first night after the hearing, Noah and I ate dinner sitting cross-legged on the floor of our new apartment. There wasn't much to it. A small 2-bedroom rental on the edge of Kettering beige walls, thin carpet, the faint smell of fresh paint and lemon cleaner still clinging to everything. The kind of place you don't brag about, but you don't feel any shame opening the door to either. We sat with paper plates balanced on our knees. Rotisserie chicken from the grocery store, a loaf of bread butter in one of those small plastic tubs. Noah took a bite, chewed, nodded slowly. Not bad. I smiled. High praise. There was no echo in these rooms, no hollow space pretending to be empty on purpose. The house was smaller than the one we'd left behind, but the air inside it felt lighter the way a building feels once you've finally taken the failing load off its frame. A few days later, the calls started. Gary's number lit up my phone again and again, then unknown numbers I didn't recognize. Then a voicemail from Renee Castillo, her voice all clipped professionalism, wrapped tightly around something close to panic. Mrs. Whitfield, please return my call at your earliest convenience. I didn't return it. I'd relinquished ownership, and along with it I'd relinquished responsibility. That had been Gary's deal from the very beginning. He wanted everything, and for the first time in his life he was getting precisely what he'd asked for. Noah adjusted faster than I expected him to. He set up his desk by the window, kept going to class, picked up extra hours at the campus library shelving returns. One evening I came home to find him in the kitchen stirring a pot of pasta, reading the instructions off his phone like it was a set of blueprints he was determined to get right. "Look at you," I said, setting my bag down by the door. "All grown up." He shrugged, but I caught the edge of a smile before he could hide it. "Somebody's got to feed us." On Sundays we still made pancakes. Boxed mixed too much butter, the same as always. Some routines survive even the worst kind of wreckage if you let them. Word traveled fast around Elkridge, the way it always does in a town that's small enough to know your business and just big enough to pretend it doesn't. Whitfield Outdoor Design stalled first, then froze, then slowly began coming apart at the seams. Vendors wanted payment on invoices that had gone quiet for months. The Larkspur property entered a long legal process over the codicil dispute, one hearing bleeding into the next. Certified letters from the tax office started arriving with return receipts, required the kind of mail nobody wants to sign for. Once at a gas station off Route 4, I ran into someone I'd known for years. He glanced at me, then looked away fast, the way people do when they've heard just enough of a story to feel awkward about the rest. "Rough deal," he said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "Yeah," I said, "but it's settled now." And it was. I thought I'd feel something bigger than what I actually felt. Some loud, satisfying rush of victory, the kind you're supposed to feel when you win. What I found instead was steadier than that. Quieter. Peace, not the loud kind that announces itself, but the kind that only shows up once you finally stop lying to yourself about what you've been holding together, and for how long, and at what cost to you. One evening, Noah and I sat on our new couch, cheap but solid, the kind that doesn't sag in the middle after 6 months watching the local weather roll across Channel 7. The meteorologist talked about a low-pressure system moving in unstable air building over the western half of the state. "Funny," Noah said, eyes on the screen, "how stuff builds up like that before it finally breaks." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it always does." He glanced over at me, quieter now. The question underneath the question. "You doing okay, Mom?" I thought about the house on Larkspur Drive, about pencil marks climbing a kitchen door frame, one careful year at a time, about the whole life I'd built inside those walls, and about the life still sitting right beside me on a second-hand couch, patient and steady, and entirely mine to keep. "I am," I said. And for the first time in a long while, I meant it completely. Gary got the house for exactly as long as it took the truth to catch up with him. I kept the home. He got the business. I kept my name clean and unencumbered, answerable to no one. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever found yourself quietly holding up something that had already started failing long before you were willing to admit it, I hope you'll take a moment tonight and really sit with what matters to you, and what you might finally be ready to set down. I'd love to know what you took from this one. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from tonight. I read every single one, and it means